everybody should be back and running. From now on, Marty's going to bed, so I am controlling his computer remotely from Australia, and there is a lag. Okay, so bear with me. Let me know in the comments in the stream if there are issues with the stream, and I will invariably endeavour to get them fixed as quickly as possible. But without much more ado, and we had 1 minute before, and we got in trouble for going early yesterday, so be very careful on our timings here. Let me introduce to you, all the way from the United Kingdom, Rob Clark. Hi,
Hello.
Rob. All right, Rob is a world famous model railroader in the flesh. So regular contributor to MRH forums, the Model Railroad Hobbyist forums, and a columnist in Model Railroad Hobbyist. And you have a fantastic layout, and you're going to share with us your passion for model railroading as an art. And
Indeed, I am.
Everyone's looking forward to this. I've seen this clinic before, and I can tell you it is awesome. So you've got some big boots to fill, but you have the boots to do it with. So what I will do is I'll make you go full screen. I will shut up. You can run with this, and people ask you questions in the comments, in the feed, and I will put them to Rob at the end.
Okay, hopefully we have time at the end because I've got a lot to say. I'm good to go?
Yeah, you can. I'm suffering a lag issue, but yeah, you can make a start, and I'm making you go full screen.
Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Rob Clark, and Cody's already explained who I am. I am responsible for the Cornhill and Atherton Railroad, which you may or may not have come across, but it's HO scale, steam, totally freelance, 1930s short line. It's in a quite small room, purpose-built, 11 feet by 8 feet, with double decks. So there's a fair amount of railroad in there. But I'll be using my railroad to illustrate examples of things that I want to show you in this session. Now, the title is Model Railroading Art, is a little playful, and we are going to explore that question. But it's more about thinking in artistic terms. So when an artist paints a picture, they have a certain method of working, certain tricks of the trade, certain rules that they use to create a picture that is interesting and makes you want to look at it. Well, then can we think in a similar way to create scenes on our model railroad? So that's what we're really looking at. But if we're going to talk about art and model railroads, we need a kind of a definition of these things. So the first one is, what is art? And it's a very small word with a very broad reach. But here's a piece of art. I omitted to find out who the artist is, but nonetheless, it's a nice piece of artwork. I like this. I like the colors. I like the way that the sun is glinting on the roofs and on the grass down here. And there's a lovely little family group in the center here. Mother and son feeding the chickens. I presume it's mother because this looks like quite a young figure. It's not an older stance. They're living in a poor place. It's very ramshackle. But I get the feeling that there's a lot of love here. It's not an unhappy place for all the poverty. And as we work our way up the hill, this place isn't quite as ramshackle. And as we work our way up, the properties become perhaps in better condition. And right up at the top, we've got what may be the landowner. Perhaps these people all rent. And there's certainly a sense of community. Whatever, it's an interesting picture. It looks good. It draws me in. So that's a bit of art. Here's another bit of art. This is by the excellent railroad painter David Tutwiler, End of an Era. And we're going to come back to this picture actually a little later, and the previous one, to talk in more detail. But this is a nice railroad picture. It's called End of an Era, and it's quite a clever title. We're looking at the Twilight Limited. It's clearly running at twilight, and we're looking at the twilight of steam passenger services. So it's a nice picture. So if that's art, what is a model railroad? Well, here's a model railroad. We would probably call this, at this point, a plywood Pacific. We've got trains, we've got track. We can run trains, but there's no scenery there. There are no buildings. And perhaps they're going to come later. Chances are they will. But some people go no further than this point. By the time they've got the track and the trains and they're running things and they've got their operations, they've got all they need, and that's cool. If they don't want scenery, they don't need it. But this isn't art. It's certainly a model railroad, but it's not a piece of art. This, on the other hand, is certainly a piece of art. This is a photograph by a very clever gentleman called, hope I pronounce this correctly, Jörg Rudi. He used to live in Zurich. I think he's gone to Brazil now. Anyway, you look at this picture and you say, is it a model? It's so good. It is a model. And if we look at the next slide, you can see how this kind of thing's done. It's done on the balcony where you lived, but it's a diorama. It's a small piece of very, very intense detail that's created with a specific purpose of looking as real as it possibly can, which is a great thing. It's something I want to try sometime. But it's not a model railroad. It's a diorama. So the model railroad is more like this. Now, this is the first picture from the Cornell in Atherton. It's clearly a model. You can tell because we've got an overscale ladder. Oops, just get this right. Oh, my pointer doesn't seem to be working. Anyway, there's an overscale ladder. We've got overscale wheels on the tender. And what we've got is an illusion of reality. So this is a nice scene. Enough people have told me that it looks pleasant for me to think, yeah, it looks okay, but it's not real. It's an illusion of reality, but we accept it as an illusion of reality and enjoy it regardless. When you go and you look at a picture in an art gallery, you know it isn't real, but it doesn't in any way stop the pleasure of what you're looking at. So, artistic approach. When I started the journey on the Cornhill in Atherton, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I did not have any artistic strategy. I just built the railroad. But as time went by, I realized that I was doing things in a structured way. I was repeating things and using certain techniques. And what I'm doing today is reverse engineering that process. Reverse engineering is just where you take something to bits to find out how it was built. And I've taken to bits how I built the railroad to work out how I got there. And that's what I'm trying to get over today. If we're going to look at this more closely, we have to decide what makes a picture look good. Why, when we look at a scene, do we think that's nice? And how do we translate those scenes into model railroading? And we need a very quick piece of anatomy here. Oh, good, my pointer's back. Here's the human eye, an absolutely wonderful device. The light comes in, goes through the lens, which muscles can change the focal length, and we project the image onto the retina, where we have lots of photoreceptors that send the image down the optic nerve to the brain. Now, we can see almost 180 degrees around us, but that is kind of blurred. There's only a small area, it's called the macula, at the back of the eye here, where we see in, let's call it HD vision. In fact, there's an even smaller area called the fovea, which is ultra HD, but that's very small. You can only see a really small area clearly. If I'm looking at this monitor now, about 3 feet away. If you're doing the same, try what I'm going to suggest. Look at the word vitreous and don't move your head, don't move your eye, and just concentrate on the word vitreous. And everything else around will be blurred. You can't see it. If you can't see it, you're cheating. And that just shows this very, very small area that you can really see clearly. But when we look at something, we see it clearly. So how does that work? How can we convert that tiny area of HD into full HD? And it's because of a thing called sassades. Start this up. So here's the human eye, and it's scanning. And some of these movements are involuntary and some are voluntary, but they're called sassades, and that's French for jerk. And it's lots and lots of little jerks while we scan and take in the picture. I'll just stop that because it's like something of a Hitchcock movie. You're waiting for something terrible to happen. So if your eyes are jerking that HD vision all over the place, how come we don't see the world in jerko vision? And that's because the brain suppresses the jerks between each of the movements. So we see it as one smooth picture. Next bit where it gets really clever is we access our life database of things to work out what we're seeing. When we are born, the world is just a mass of color and shapes and noises, and we really don't know what's going on. But really quickly, the incredible thing that's a brain starts working out what all the things are around us. So we know what a pencil is. We know what a piece of paper is because we've experienced it, we've used it. and we look at the relationships of things. We know that we can use the pencil to write on the paper, and we can infer things just by seeing one object. We can work out that other objects exist. So we see an apple core, we know it used to be an apple. We can't see it, but we know it because of our experiences. And we can build a story about what we see, and then we may make some feelings and judgments. So this guy who's looking at me is looking rather dangerous. I need to move away because he might hurt me. And this is all through just looking at a few things and working out what's going on. So if we go back to the railroad picture by Mr. Tutwiler and have a look at a possible set of facades that might go on, we start by looking at the central part of the picture, because there are three trains here. We look at the carriage here, the train that's about to leave. We see it's called the Twilight Limited. We back that up by looking that it's on track 29. It's a Twilight Limited. We can see the light above that it's likely to be leaving at twilight. Cross to the train that's just arrived, and then back across to here, perhaps to this guy who's just got inside the carriage. He's got his hat on, so maybe he just arrived and sat down. Maybe he likes hats. Hats are cool. He keeps it on. We head down to the attendant who's waiting to welcome people. We can see that this is a long platform, and even though this is a completely flat picture, the artist has drawn in the perspective. We know that the side of this coach is a rectangle, but we see it as a parallelogram, so we know that this is looking off into the distance. Here's a lady striding purposefully down, presumably to board the train. There's a chap next to her. Now he's curious because is it her son? Probably not. It looks male, but there's a case and a hat. It almost looks like a miniature human being, but there's no connection between these two, really. They're not psychologically connected. And he's looking at the train that's passing through. So we have one of each, one about to leave, one arrived, one passing through. And then we head back across, and there's a bag here. Now, what's that all about? Is it something that somebody forgot to take on the train? Is somebody standing beside us about to get that bag? Who knows? The point is we have a story that's built up by just looking at the picture. And the artist has led us to those different parts of the story very cleverly. We need to do a deeper dive into what makes a picture or scene successful. And we're going to look at content, things that are there, composition, how they're related to each other, balance, so where in the picture are the things that we're interested in, what's the color like, what's the texture like, and most importantly, is there a story to be told? Excuse me, a little drink of water there. Content first, clearly identifiable elements. Now here's a picture I found on the net. I think it probably advertises a Gardner Fantasy Railroad. So I'm showing this out of context purely for the purposes of this presentation. It's no criticism of the photograph. But we have one clearly identifiable element in the middle, and that's the train. After that, things get a little bit more hazy. There is a track with some curious log pilings. There's a lot of slightly out of focus ferns. We've got what looks like some twisted wire. For those of you who watch Star Wars, that looks like something out of an Ewok town. Some kind of outhouse, a machine gun tower from Bridge on the River Kwai. It's all a bit confusing. As I say, we're seeing it out of context, but it's not really clear what's here. This is a picture from the Cornhill Atherton, CNA, and here things are pretty clear. We have our track, we have our road, we've got a row of company houses with a path running up there. We've got trees and we've got sky. And it's all pretty clear what we're looking at. No story, but we know what it is. Composition. There are a lot of clearly identifiable elements here. We've got our rock and our trees and our undergrowth, more rock and background hills and sky. However, the picture is very flat. It's a kind of a splurge of information. It's not really clear what's going on. If we look at the same scene, and it is the same scene, rock, tree, rock, go back, rock, tree, rock. All we've done is rotate through 90 degrees and drop down a little. Things now are very different. We've got our railroad track, which grounds us in the scene. We know why we're here. We can see the slope of the landscape running down, where Presumably the track was cut out to get through. We've got the track going off into the distance. We've got our trees and our skyline. And it's all quite pleasant and all quite clear because the composition is different. And if we're going to talk about composition, we need to talk about the rule of thirds. Those of you who are anything to do with photography will have come across this. It's not a rule, it's a guideline. But what it basically says is that if you want to compose your picture, you should consider having it in 3 horizontal sections, optionally as well 3 vertical sections. And if you want objects to be of particular interest, to stand out, pop, you should put them on the intersections of these zones. So what does that mean in real terms? Here we've got a picture that's showing the horizontal rules of thirds. This is the most common use of it. We have the ground beneath our feet. We have the sky and the trees above us, and the bit in the middle where we live and we look. And this is obviously the most successful kind of presentation of a picture because it's the way we live our lives. And it's very easy to identify with what we see, on a regular basis. Doing it vertically, in this particular picture, we've divided it into those 3 zones. We have buildings left and right, and our road down the middle to some buildings in the distance. And it's quite a pleasing, balanced kind of picture. Going back to our first Cornhill and Atherton scene, if we overlay the grid, we can see that we have the lower section with the tender and the coaling stage, and then we have the upper part of the coaling stage, the tender itself, and then up top we have the water tank. And roughly on the intersections, we have the tender, the fireman, the coaling stage base, and I guess the water tank. It's not precise. So that is a kind of an indication as to why that picture is quite attractive to look at, because it follows those guidelines. Let's have a look at symmetrical balance. Here's a picture which I took to particularly demonstrate symmetrical balance. So we have our arrow down the middle, which is the turntable. And then to the right and left, we have locomotives and structures. Our hill in the back is symmetrical. And it's all very pleasant, but kind of contrived. And I know it's contrived because I did it deliberately to show this balance. In contrast to that, we can have asymmetrical balance. Now in this picture, the object of interest is right over to the right-hand side of the picture in that right-hand zone. The thing is kind of zoned. We've got the stream below, we've got in the middle, we've got the locomotive and the trees, and we've got the sky above, but it's very much skewed to one side. And that kind of symmetrical balance, this skewed, can be a little bit unsettling. So how do we do things asymmetrically, which are more interesting, but not make them confusing? We need to talk a little bit about a chap called Fibonacci, who is an Italian, or was an Italian mathematician, 12th century, I think, clever dude. And he invented a thing called the Fibonacci sequence. It's a sequence of numbers where you add the number is made up of the sum of the previous 2. So 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 3 equals 5, 5 plus 8 equals 13, etc. Now, more interestingly, if we start dividing these numbers, we get to a thing called the golden ratio. So 1 divided by 1 is 1, 2 divided by 1 is 2, 3 divided by 2, 1.5, 5 divided by 3, 1.6, and we approach this magical number of 1.618. So for those of you who watch The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or read it, the meaning of life is not 42, it's 1.618. And this number and this ratio occur an awful lot in art and nature. What it really means is if you have 3 objects, then the distance from A to C is a meter, and the distance from C to B is 0.618 meters. It's offset slightly from the 2/3 third point. That would be 1.5 if it was there. And that is a pleasing visual ratio. It also can be converted, this marvelous Fibonacci series, into this spiral. And what is happening here is that we're stacking up a series of squares, and the sizes are the numbers of the sequence. So we've got 2 1x1 squares, 2x2 stacked on above, 3x3 to the left, 5x5 below, and we're drawing arcs across these squares, and we get this spiral effect. And this occurs quite a lot in the world. If I look here, It's in the stars above our heads. It's in nature. It's in creatures. It's a kind of a growth algorithm. And again, it's very pleasing. Now, if we look at this picture again, show you it earlier on, and we overlay that golden ratio, we see that the primary scene, the mother and the son and the chickens and the little shed there, sit right on that golden section point horizontally. And curiously enough, they also sit right on it vertically as well. Now, I'm not saying that the artist did this deliberately, but they probably did it naturally because it feels good. It satisfies some visual sense. Now, another example. I did this photograph for the Roundhouse magazine. That's the British region NMRA magazine a couple of years ago. It's a cover photograph. And I knew I had to create a portrait A4 picture. And I cropped this from a much larger picture. And it's quite pleasant. And I thought as an experiment, I'd overlay that golden spiral on it. Oops. And what do you know? It sits right on the picture. The locomotive is just about on the golden section, both horizontally and vertically. And right from the center of the spiral, we loop out and the picture flows around that spiral. Now, I didn't do that deliberately, but naturally, I ended up doing that because it felt right for the picture, natural. And in fact, quick look, it happens. Here's an example from the net. Here's a photograph by a guy called Robert Greenham, and he's got two sets of these golden spirals with flowing motion in the pictures where your eye follows it. Very pleasant. Okay, how do we use this asymmetrical balance in practical terms in scenery? Well, here's an example. Trees should be in odd numbers, 3s, 5s. And incidentally, 7 is a great odd number because up to 7, the human brain can almost instantly work out how many are there. 7 and beyond, it has to start counting. So if you want something to look like a lot or a train to look long, have 7 or more cars or objects in it, and the human brain can't quickly count them. But 3s are pleasing, 5s are pleasing. And here we're mixing things up by having different slopes on the background, midground, and foreground. They're all going at different heights. We've got 3D tree lines above the backdrop. There's no reason you can't do that. We've got a rock here, which is acting as a view block, so we can't really tell what's going on in here and adding a bit of mystery. So that's a way of asymmetrically making sure that your scenery doesn't have repeating patterns in it. Humans, if they create something, create symmetrical things, and you have to make a fairly conscious effort to create something that is asymmetrical. Color, excuse me, another quick drink. Here's a picture I picked up off the net. I like this scene. I like the way the road draws you down into the distance with another little offshoot here. I like the way the buildings are laid out in an interesting pattern. So they're not in straight lines. However, the color I find a little strange. The colors are a little too precise. And if I had to use a word for this, I would say it's somewhat surreal because of those colors. They're just a little bit too strong. Now, what I always do when I'm building a railroad is to go for, I suppose, washed out colors. This is an unfinished scene on the Cornhill in Atherton. You actually looked down this street a little earlier on. And this is how it looks. The colors are very muted. And that's because bright colors are not normally found in the distances that we see things in real life. When you're looking at your model railroad, you're really looking at it from hundreds of yards away, not just 2 yards. And distance fogs vision because of water vapor and the restrictions of the human eye. So by having muted colors, it helps to increase that sense of realism and oneness with the scene. Use of color again. I use an awful lot of greens, grays, whites, browns, muted colors. They please me. I find them very relaxing, very pleasant, very natural. But you do need to have some pieces of color. Example here is this switch stand. Little bit of red. It breaks the scene up. It slows the eye down. So you do need little accents of color. My wife and I are interested in Oriental gardening. And this is something that happens quite often in Oriental gardens, where you have masses of green, but little flashes of color to add interest and accent. Texture. This was a scene I photographed quite a few years ago. It's Paxman Engineering in Mortimer on the upper deck, the Cornhill in Atherton. And I was quite pleased with the scene until I had a good look at the dog, who is called Shadow, by the way. And he looked like somebody'd been polishing him with boot polish. Not natural. So I fixed it, and I applied texture to the dog in the form of some weathering powders and some glue. And now I have, as one forum member said, a hillbilly poodle. But he looks much more natural than he did before. And rougher textures are easier on the eye. It often pays to exaggerate a texture. Sand, for example. Sand, if you did it to scale proportions, you wouldn't even be able to see there was any sand there. So exaggerating things sometimes improves their viewability. We get on to story. Story is probably the most important thing. Railroads only exist because of people. They move people from A to B. They move people's goods from B to C. They are operated by people. Without people, there isn't a railroad. And that's the context that you have to see your model in. But people are difficult. They're difficult to model, and I'm going to cover some of those aspects. But the thing is that they add story. You ask the questions: where have they come from? Why are they here? What are they doing? Where are they going next? Everyone has purpose. Even when people are doing nothing, they have purpose. And you have to be careful to make sure that those purposes are visible and people aren't just stuck in a scene for the sake of it. Now, I didn't like putting models on my scenes initially. I avoided it. And you don't have to have people to be able to see that there are people there. So, for example, it's an implication here that there are people. There's washing on the line. There's a broom waiting to be used. There's clearly somebody just inside this door. There's a bicycle outside. It looks like some children have arrived. So even though there's nobody there, the scene's bustling with energy, as is this one. This is where I've taken inspiration from things. Apart from the dogs, there's not a human in sight. But clearly, there's a lot going on. This is a bustling with activity. Just the people aren't visible at the moment. Here, there are very few people, but it's a similar thing. We have some chickens and we have a few kids there. Kids and chickens are good. There's a lot of activity, but it's not visible. And what you can do is, again, it's a bit like the implication. You can imply that something's going on just through this darkened area. An unloading or loading operation is taking place. Somebody's in there. You don't have to see them. You know they're there. In fact, they are there. And here's that scene from another view. And showing the back side of people, just a glimpse, is a good way of introducing human figures without showing faces. Faces can be a bit of a problem because, going back to the baby born analogy, the first thing a baby really works out is the facial features of the parents. And we, through all of our life, are very intimately knowledgeable about the human face. So it's very difficult to replicate it. But if you show the backside of a figure, then there's no issue. It's still worth showing people's faces because you've got to have some people around. Here we've got a group of people and they're in conversation. So there's purpose to the group. This chap's talking, these guys are listening. We don't know what about. Perhaps there's been a problem with the engine. Maybe it's just an end of day session. Who knows? But they are conversing, and it's clear that that's happening. Kids and chickens. We've got some kids here. They've been throwing stones on the roof. This chap up here is having a conversation with what looks like a rooster. So there's a bit of humor there, a little bit of activity, things to look at. Dogs. Where there are dogs, there are people. So again, we're not seeing the people, but we're seeing the dog. Dogs don't have that facial recognition issue that I mentioned, so we can use them freely. There's another one over here. And because the dog's there, we know the people are there. Okay. We've been talking about 2 dimensions. Obviously, all I can show you is 2 dimensions. Even if I showed you a picture of the train room when trains operating, it still would be in 2 dimensions. But the train room is a 3D world. And we need to apply some of the principles we're looking at in 2 dimensions and get them into 3 dimensions to see how we would use them. The first problem is depth. Depth is a problem in terms of showing it in 2 dimensions, but it's a problem in the world of the train room as well, because we always want more depth. We want the place to look bigger than it is. And of course, we have the moving viewpoint problem. When an artist paints a picture, you can only see that picture from that one point of view, the one that they are showing you. When you go in a train room, you can walk around. And that means they can look at it from any angle. So how can we influence how they look at your railroad? Okay. Problem of depth. We can deal with the increase of depth in quite a few ways. No straight lines, no such thing as flat. Layering our scenery, appropriately designing our backdrop, integrating it with our scenery, using the technique of force perspective, and borrowing scenery. Okay, let's look at those in more detail. This is Mortimer up a deck, and there's not a straight line in sight. The tracks are all curved. The buildings are on a curve. The front valance is all curved. Now, in the real world, railroaders like to go on straight lines because it's the shortest distance between 2 points. On the model, we don't want to do that. We want to slow down the view. We want to have a gentle curve, which is much more easy on the eye and more interesting to watch the trains moving around those curves. So avoid straight lines at all costs. No such thing as flat. Here you can see the fascia contour is carried back into this landscape. It's all over the place. There's nothing flat here at all other than the track bed, and even that is actually on a slight incline. So in the real world, things aren't flat. And even where we have a surface that is flat-ish, like this under construction yard for the sawmill, it's not quite flat. I don't know how well you can see this because of the resolution loss, but this whole area has been built on a piece of 3/32, maybe slightly 5/16 laminate foam. And that laminate foam is a great sound deadener for the track, but also I can cut it away. Shallow cutouts and then just that's bits of sculptor mold to feather them. And we get lots of little indentations because even flat land isn't flat. We can layer our scenery. It's a bit like when you go to the theatre and you're looking towards the theatre and the stage will be raked up to the back and there'll be different flats and scenery going off into the distance. So from our fascia, we look up. At the back, we have our back scene, which is obviously 2 dimensions, and it can be painted with the sky and multiple distance layers. We can have an optional low relief flat, some other hills in there with some texture on them. Probably the most important bit is our background tree line, which sits on a thing called a berm, which is just a bank falling away. That doesn't join the back scene directly. We'd see that. Because it falls away and we're looking across, we can't see what's happening in that little gap. Is it a yard? Is it 10 yards? Is it 100 yards? Is it 10 kilometers? Depending on how the back scene's been drawn, we get that effective distance. Half an inch, half a mile. The tracks can be put between little ditches. We have some lower foreground trees here that lead our eye up and then obviously to the fascia. So, sonic layering, very effective. Here's a scene using those techniques, and from front to back, it's 17 inches, but it looks a lot further because of the scenic layering. We've got an additional trick going on here. There's a mirror which pushes the back scene back considerably, and it's sitting behind this embankment. And there it is. The mirror is running here. It's a scientific mirror, which means the silvering is on the front, and that means you can't see the layer of glass that you would see with a conventional mirror. That pipe is in fact a half pipe, and it reflects on there, those two rocks. Very effective. The mirror is sitting here, we're looking down. If you're standing in the aisle, you can't be seen in the mirror because the embankment runs across and blocks the view, and the embankment is reflected in the mirror. And there it is under construction, just to show that I did actually build something. Okay. You can use a similar trick with berms and backdrops with roads. This road curves around and then this is a two-dimensional road on the back scene. There's a little hump there, like a little berm, and that hides the gap between the back scene and the baseboard, and it's very effective. More so, I must say, in photographs, but it's still effective on the railroad as well. Here's another example. The bump, the berm, is sitting about there. Now, backdrop design. I sourced these images from Google, and you can do an awful lot with Photoshop or similar packages. You can cut, paste, zoom, reverse, all sorts of things. And that's what I did with this scene, which is an earlier view of Mortimer. We saw it earlier with the curves, no such thing as straight. And this whole backdrop is one huge image built in Photoshop from those elements I showed you before. And it's pretty effective. Even though we're looking at this at quite an oblique angle, you can see the fascia here and the track, it holds up reasonably well, even without any three-dimensional trees in there. But creating this was quite labor intensive. I enjoyed it. I can use Photoshop now, but it takes a long time, and you have to do test prints, and it uses ink, and it's quite hard work. And I actually regressed to what's probably a much earlier technique for doing scenery after this, and I did it using decoupage, which is basically just printing and cutting out pieces of scenery and sticking them on top of each other to get scenes. So what we have here is 1, 2, 3, that's it over there, at 4, and a piece down here, 5 pieces that I'm sticking on the backdrop to make up a scene. You can do it with blue tack initially, just to try positioning them, and then you glue it in when you're happy. That's glue there. So when we look at the next picture, we've added that missing piece, and now it's starting to integrate. We've got to do this piece over here, and in the next picture, we've added more trees, and then finally, here's the finished scene with all the three-dimensional trees added. Now, we're not seeing through to a lot of that backdrop, but we do see it. And as you look at it from different angles, you see other bits of this backdrop. So although it's quite a bit of work, it's well worth the effort. Here's another example. Everything to the right here is three-dimensional, but all of this is two-dimensional and pretty effective, done using that decoupage technique. And here it is with three-dimensional trees. This is actually a helicopter view, so it's probably not as kind as it could be, but it still looks fairly good. Forced perspective. This is the Palazzo Spada in Rome. The total distance from the front to the back is just over 20 feet, but it looks more like 120 feet. And it's because the artist, obviously working with the architect, has created a set of smaller columns as we move backwards, and therefore forcing the perspective that isn't really there. And I've used that kind of technique on the railroad. This is a helix hidden inside a hill, peninsula. And up at the back here, we have a set of trees which are significantly smaller than the other trees in the foreground to push back that part of the scene. This was all built as a separate module. There it is under construction in our conservatory. And there it is in place on the top of the peninsula over the helix. And it was built separately because obviously reaching the back of this area was going to get more difficult as more construction was done. So it was done that way. Forced perspective works with the absence of things as well. Under these trees, we have, a couple of, and my pointer's gone again. Oh, it's back, right. We have a couple of dark areas that are just nothing. But you will know from personal experience, if you go out into the forest and you see darkness under the trees, you know there's a lot of forest going back over because it's hiding all the light. And that's the effect you get here. Those dark areas push back the scenery and make it seem much further away and much deeper than it really is. Borrowed scenery. The Japanese term is shakai. I mentioned earlier, Jean and I like Oriental gardening. Borrowing scenery is where you see a scene that you don't own. That's how it works in the gardening terms. You see something beyond the boundaries of the area that you own. But you can do it in certain circumstances in your train room. Here, and this is obviously looking at the Cornhill Atherton top down, I have a peninsula because I have this helix. Somebody standing here looking across this way, we'll see this scene. So all of this is borrowed. We're looking across and seeing on the other side of the aisle. And it's very effective, particularly for taking photographs. But it's also nice when you're in the train room and you look at, this is about eye level, by the way, it's 51, 52 inches. It's very effective because it pushes back the scenery that you see. It works as well when you come into the train room and you look this way, you see this scene. So in the background, that is Atherton Town and the sawmill that we saw earlier on. That's way in the background of this scene. The moving viewpoint. You can't hold people's heads and point them at different parts of your railroad and say, look at this, look at this. So we have to do something to help with that. Now, the first point I'm making is the holistic experience. It sounds a bit grand. It's the first time you go into the railroad and you see the whole railroad at once. There's that wow moment. And then you decide, consciously or otherwise, where you're going to look next. And the holistic experience is about how we control the way people look at the railroad and build up the scenes bit by bit. We're going to use view blocks to divide things up. Sorry, I keep doing divide things up so that things are clearly in different areas. And then within those, we're going to use a thing called visual hierarchy, which controls how people look at the scenes as best we can. The holistic experience. So in my train room, everything is curved, everything is flowing. All of the fascias, and this is obviously the upper fascia, are curved and flowing. And that helps you to not see them. What we're trying to do is make something disappear as far as possible so that people don't notice it. When you go to an art gallery, the picture has a frame and a border around it, but you don't really see them. All it does is that separates the real world from the picture, and you focus on the picture, and the fascias should do the same. Everything flows as much as possible to make that you focus on this area in between where the railroad lives, the world that you want people to look at lives. View blocks, they're fairly straightforward. I'm sure you've come across them before. Here is a outcropping, which blocks the view of the train as it moves from this scene to the next. That's only about 10, 12 inches long. It's all you need. All you have to do is break up the train, and the brain does the rest for you. It divides the spaces up. Another one here. These trees here divide up this scene from this scene. Atherton Town from Red Pale Creek. The visual hierarchy. I'm going to use some terms that I'm using purely for my own satisfaction. The module, the scene, the vignette, and the cameo. So smaller and smaller areas that we want the viewer to look at. Now here we are looking at one wall, and we have two modules, the upper and lower decks. These are about 6 to 8 feet long. I think that's a good size for a visual module, an area of opportunity. People can look at this and they're not moving their head around, and it fits quite naturally with a glance. Within the modules, we're going to look more closely at the bottom one. There are 3 scenes, this one, and this one. And they kind of stand out. Scenes with a bit of space in between them. Looking at the first one, this is on the left-hand end of the module. Clearly an agricultural scene, feed and seed, the grain elevator, a livery stable. There's a threshing machine here suggesting activities that go on elsewhere, the horse. It's a pleasant agricultural scene, and within it, there are things that we might want to look more closely. For example, the livery stable. So that's the vignette, where the scene stands in its own, but looking at this, you would actually be drawn to look out over from here. We've got the livery stable with the doors open to let the smells out. The horse is relaxing. The guys are watching the trains go by. We've got the shade tree. It's all very pleasant. And we can go in one more level if we wish. So inside the livery stable, we have this scene. And I took the time, pure personal indulgence. The horses are in their stables. There's hay on the floor. There's feed. There's a horse drinking at the trough. The guys are sitting around. It's It's something that people might never look at, but if they wanted to, if they look round the corner, they can see it if they want to. And it's somewhere to indulge your detailing. You don't have to go to this level of detail on the whole railroad, but you can do it in small areas. So that's leading the people down to look at smaller and smaller parts of the railroad. And each scene can hold together following the rules we spoke of before, because people will naturally align themselves to see things in the best light. Here is a scene at the right-hand end. This is Purdue paper. While I'm here, I'd just like to mention this piece of scrub, which is in fact my favorite part of the whole railroad, just because it goes up and down all over the place. There are layer upon layer upon layer of scenic effects, and it's just scrub. But I look at it and it makes me feel good. Strange. So within this scene, we then are drawn into this area here. We've got the stagnant pond. Probably the flies will be causing havoc for the guys working there. It's all very green and grey and white, but we do have the accents. We've got the oil tank. We've got the leather upholstery, which are breaking it up ever so slightly, so it's not boring. And then we can go in another level, and here we've got this guy leaning on the bench, waiting for something to happen. And it's all grey and green again, but the star of the show is the paint burner in the center here, which is green, but it's standing out. It's a brighter green, so it just is that little offset, that little accent in the scene. Okay, one more. The center scene, looking through town, road going off into the back scene. This is Levi Vosborough's veterinary surgeon's premises, and he or his signwriter can't spell veterinary. There's Mrs. Vosborough looking anxiously down the track. And in the hen house behind, we have the elder Vosborough daughter who's seeing to the hens. And nobody might ever see this scene. I, again, made this purely because I wanted to do something interesting, and that little cameo was sitting in there if people go looking, but they may not. Okay, that was the artistic approach. It's about observing the world. It's about using that life database of things to make your model railroad. You don't necessarily have to copy stuff. There's an infinite rule set out there, the form and function of the world. Follow the world and let it seem natural to you, and it's going to be okay. I initially wanted to copy other people's work. John Allen's Goring Defeated, for example. But I realized that copying was not the way to go, because you can't do what other people did. They've done it from their life's experiences and their skills, and you should do it with your life experiences and your skills. Make the scenes attractive from many angles, because people will look at them from many angles, and you'll enjoy doing that work. If it looks wrong to you, fix it, because you will remain uncomfortable with it. You don't have to fix it for somebody else's satisfaction, but if you look at it and you're not comfortable, fix it, because it'll come back and haunt you. And scenery is soft. It's ever so easy to change things. So change them. It's your railroad and you can do what you want. Everything that I've said today is just based on my experiences. And these are things that I do that make me happy. But the only person you have to please is you. It's your railroad. So take all the time it takes you, create scenes that make you happy, and you will be a happy person. Is model railroading art? Of course it is. And there we end. Still there, Gordy?
Gordy's still here. Gordy is just, if you just want to stop sharing for me.
Yep.
There we go. That's great. Let me stick my camera back on. I didn't want to distract the presenter there. So that was absolutely fantastic. We got some really good comments there coming in from people saying that their wives have just stopped what they're doing and watching the stream. Non-model railroaders in the house have started watching your presentation. I think that's just blown quite a few people's heads. A lot of people ask a lot of the time, why do the European, the British layouts, the small layouts look so good? And I think you've just let all our trade secrets out, so that's okay. We'll forgive you. But we do have one question, and people, I am watching this feed. It's why I'm looking away. You like to see the side of my head a lot. But I am watching this feed. We've got a question here that says, this is from James. When using the cameo, do you run the risk that once used in a scene or maybe a couple of scenes on the layout, the observer will expect it to be included in every single scene on your layout?
Possibly. And there's a reason for doing a lot of cameos. I think that not having one doesn't mean that people are disappointed. They just stop looking at the level that the scene stops at. So I wouldn't worry about it. It's the icing on the cake.
That's great. Okay, let's have a look. See more questions coming in. Will we share this presentation? We will share this this video. We will do that. That's no problem. Everyone's just saying thanks. Great presentation. Great presentation. So I think what we'll do is Gordy, with the power of connect through the internet, we'll cut the audio. So we'll say goodbye to Rob. Thank you, Rob.
My pleasure. I'm going to have a big cup of coffee now.
I don't blame you. I could do with that. Yeah, I could do with a big cup of coffee. So we'll all be back in about 10 minutes. We'll get the next person into the studio here, and we'll catch up with you soon. Thanks, everybody.